They say we're living in the most connected time in history, with more followers, more messages, and more ways to stay in touch than ever before. So why do some people disappear intentionally? Why do they stop replying, stop showing up, and stop explaining themselves? And the most confusing part is that they don't seem lonely, they seem more peaceful. So let me ask you something. What if the people who cut everyone off aren't broken? What if they're the ones who finally understood something the rest of us are still ignoring? Because you weren't always like this. There was a version of you who replied instantly, who showed up first. You were the reliable one, the person people called at 2 a.m., the one who listened, really listened. You didn't just have friends. You carried them emotionally, and for a long time, you believed that was what connection meant: effort, sacrifice, and showing up no matter what. Until one day, something didn't feel right anymore. You genuinely needed someone, and suddenly, everyone was busy. And in that moment, something shifted quietly. You didn't become angry, you became aware. Because your brain did something most people don't notice. It began identifying patterns. In psychology, this is linked to predictive processing, your brain's ability to anticipate outcomes based on past experiences. When the same emotional pattern repeats enough times, your brain stops expecting a different result. You started noticing things you used to overlook, who only reached out when they needed something, who disappeared when things became difficult, and who showed up for fun but not for you. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. So you asked yourself a question: is this connection or just access? That question is where people think you became cold, but in reality, that's where you became selective. You stopped explaining yourself to people who never tried to understand you. You stopped investing energy where there was no emotional return. You stopped performing a version of yourself just to keep others comfortable. And then something unexpected happened. The silence came, but it didn't feel empty. It felt calm. There were no constant notifications, no emotional pressure, just you and your peace. And that quiet had a real effect on your brain. There's a concept called nervous system regulation, where your mind shifts out of constant stress mode. When your environment becomes less overwhelming, your brain stops preparing for emotional threats. That's why you suddenly felt lighter, not because you lost people, but because you lost the burden of managing them. But this pattern didn't begin here. It started much earlier. Somewhere in your past, your brain learned something important. Maybe you were the child who had to handle things alone, or your emotions were dismissed as too much, or asking for support led to disappointment. So your brain adapted. It formed what psychologists call an avoidant attachment pattern, a tendency to rely on yourself because depending on others felt unsafe. And that pattern doesn't disappear. It follows you into adulthood. So you didn't stop caring. You just started protecting. From the outside, that protection looks like distance. People say, "You've changed." But what they really mean is, you stopped being convenient. Because when you were always available, no one questioned it. But the moment you stepped back, it became noticeable. Suddenly, you're distant, different, hard to reach. But here's the truth. They didn't lose you. They lost access to a version of you that was overgiving. Now here's what most people misunderstand. They think cutting everyone off is emotional or impulsive, but in reality it's often the opposite. It's calculated. Your brain starts evaluating relationships through what psychology calls cost-benefit analysis. You begin asking, how much do I give, how much do I receive, and how do I feel after interacting with this person? And when the answer is consistently draining, you naturally withdraw. That's not bitterness. That's your brain conserving your emotional energy. So instead of trying to fix people, you start filtering them. And here's the paradox no one talks about. The loneliest you ever felt wasn't after you cut everyone off. It was before, sitting in a room full of people and still feeling invisible. That kind of loneliness changes you because it teaches you something important, and that is, presence doesn't equal connection. So when you finally walked away, you didn't create loneliness. You just stopped pretending it wasn't already there. That's why it felt like relief. There's a difference between walls and boundaries. Walls block everyone, whereas boundaries filter them. But after enough negative experiences, even boundaries can look like walls, and maybe for a while that's necessary. Because what you're really doing is recalibrating. You're no longer asking, who wants me? You're asking, who deserves access to me? Because now connection isn't about quantity, it's about emotional safety. Research consistently shows that even one emotionally safe relationship can regulate your nervous system more effectively than dozens of shallow ones. So if your circle became smaller, it doesn't mean you lost people. It means you refined them. Because the goal was never isolation, it was clarity. Clarity about your worth, your energy, and your limits. And once you have that, you don't need to cut everyone off anymore. You simply stop allowing the wrong people to stay. So if your world has become quieter, your circle gets smaller, and people have started calling you different, maybe nothing is wrong. If this made you feel understood, you already know why. Subscribe the channel before you lost us, because the next video might explain something about you. You felt your whole life but never had the words for